Welcome, everyone, to the Rosenbach's annual Bloomsday Virtual In Conversation. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the home of the most complete manuscript of James Joyce's Ulysses. And as part of our Bloomsday celebrations every year, we invite a James Joyce scholar or creator to share an aspect of Joyce's masterpiece, Ulysses. And this year, we bring you Dr. Clare Hutton. Clare, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you. So nice of you to join us from the UK, where it is quite hot now. I've heard from more than one person over there that the weather has become quite hot. So I appreciate you joining us, especially later in the evening, as it is for you. Well, everyone, this is the final program we're having before Bloomsday on June 16th. We've had presentations from our collections. We had a preview screening from the creators of the new documentary Left Bank, the visionary women behind James Joyce and Ulysses. And we had a Sylvia Beach soiree at the Rosenbach, which was quite nice. And we invite all of you to join us for our annual celebration of Bloomsday on June 16th. Our Bloomsday is a day-long public reading held on Delancey Place. We close off the street outside the Rosenbach with readings and musical performances all day long. Joyce enthusiasts and novice alike can drop by any time to listen to the reading, enjoy free admission to the Rosenbach, where we have a new exhibition up called Succession: Why Presidential History Matters Now. And you can all relax in a beer garden. We have a special a special Bloomsday brew this year from our partners at Attic Brewing Company. There's even going to be a whiskey tasting from new Bloomsday sponsor, Sláinte Irish Whiskey. We'll have food trucks. We have Irish music all day long. It's going to be a lot of fun. Claire, I so hope you can make it out to Bloomsday one year at the Rosenbach. Would be really nice. And for all of you who can't make it to Philadelphia, you can watch the live stream of the readings and music on the Rosenbach's YouTube channel. So, and before we begin tonight, I'd like to thank all of you who are joining us live. We bring this program to you for free. So if you'd like to help support the Rosenbach, either by donation or by becoming a member, you can do so by visiting our website. Your support helps us care for our collections, like the Ulysses manuscript and the rest of our world-class Joyce collection, but also your support helps us bring more programs like this one to you. And finally, if you're watching live and you want to ask a question tonight during the presentation, after the presentation, we're on Zoom, so put it in the Q&A tab on Zoom. And the chat, feel free to use the chat to talk among yourselves, make your own comments as we go along. That's perfectly okay. If you're watching this recording on the YouTube channel, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. On with the show. Clare Hutton is reader in English and digital humanities at Loughborough University in the UK and the author of Serial Encounters, Ulysses and the Little Review from Oxford in 2019. In addition to extensive research at the Harry Ransom Center, she has recently been a library fellow at the Firestone in Princeton, where she looked at the papers of Shakespeare and Company, and her exhibition included a blog series, Women and the Making of Ulysses, A History in 10 Objects. Clare, this is indeed a great pleasure to have you here for this annual Bloomsday talk. Thank you so much. Are you ready? Good. All righty. Now, Clare is going to present, and I'm going to turn my video off, and then I will jump back on the end to field any questions you may have. And if you have them, put them in the Q&A on the Zoom interface. And you can begin, Clare.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm just trying to work out how to, yeah, there we are. I'll go back to my title image. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and it's a privilege to do this. I have been to Philadelphia once. It was a very long time ago. It was 2002. And I did indeed visit the Rosenbach, just not to see the library, but just to get it as far as the museum area. And I did see the manuscript, and it's a manuscript, of course, of great interest to me as a textual Joyce person. So it's a real honor to do this. So thank you for the invitation. So as you mentioned, I was the curator last year of Women in the Making of Joyce's Ulysses. So this major exhibition that went up at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, which and the exhibition consisted of about 200 objects. What did we look at? Photographs, personal letters, first editions, manuscripts. And in a way, what the purpose of putting the things on display was to show the kind of world of labor of women whose significance has often been kind of downplayed or overlooked in literary history. So that was the sort of central thesis of the exhibit. What I'm going to do today is to review some of the things that went on display, and to give some sense of the kind of look and feel of the exhibit, highlight and showcase some of the objects and indeed the whole approach of the exhibit. Talk a bit about the structure of why certain women were picked out of the many that one could bring into the story, and to show how there was a sort of balance between kind of women in Joyce's personal life and the women in the kind of professional sphere, particularly those associated with the book trades. So in a way, just to begin, just with a few obvious statements, really. Ulysses is the world's most famous Irish novel, but three of the women who worked so hard to see Ulysses into print, Margaret Anderson, Jane Heap, and Sylvia Beach, were American. Not only were they American, they were also gay. Why did these women facilitate the publication of a work that was deemed to be a piece of literature of, in the words of the time, of unmitigated filth and obscenity? And how did they feel about that legacy? What role did other women play in helping Joyce? And in a way, the aim of the exhibit was to provide insights into women, into domesticity, the world of work, and to invite new readers and new readings of Ulysses. As Edward mentioned, the exhibit builds a little bit on existing work, particularly my monograph, Serial Encounters, Ulysses and the Little Review. And I also published a kind of what turned out to be a fairly extensive blog series. So some of what I'm going to say today has been written up and exists in that blog series, A History in 10 Objects. This, in a sense, was what the galleries looked like. It was quite a big exhibit. Where did we start? Here are some women looking, as you can see, just at the very opening of the exhibit, the very first kind of gallery room that you went into. One of these women on the left looking at, well, they're actually looking at this rather remarkable, pristine first edition. The Ransom Center has, I think, 35 first editions of Ulysses. And this one, copy number 36, was especially pristine. It was the copy that Sylvia Beach kept in her shop long after Joyce had kind of departed from the kind of area around the Rue de l'Odeon, one which she kept personally. I'm going to talk a little bit about first editions and special first editions, but I'll come back to that in a minute. One of the things we did right at the very beginning was to sort of put up a very famous photograph, a slightly snide move in a way, of some of the men who are very obviously behind Ulysses. As you can see from this photo, we've got Ezra Pound slouched in a chair. Behind him, John Quinn, who indeed was the first purchaser of the Ulysses manuscript, which we now know as the Rosenbach manuscript. And beside them, Ford Maddox Ford, and a slightly bewildered looking Joyce sitting there, being a kind of man of letters. I think the photograph was taken in 1923. And of course, Pound did a great deal to facilitate Joyce's career, as did John Quinn. A number of things you can say about the photograph that's been reprinted many times, that the image is a kind of visual reminder of an important network of connections that helped Joyce to realize Ulysses, but it most definitely doesn't tell the whole story. Pound had wanted to start a modernist literary periodical of his own in 1915 and had contemplated what he described as a male review with the banner, "No woman shall be allowed to write for this magazine," on the grounds that he was, quote, fed up on gynocracy. And the person who was going to facilitate Pound in realizing this was actually John Quinn. In the event, the plans for Pound's male review came to nothing because Pound realized it was easier to work with women who'd already established magazines of their own, notably The Egoist and The Little Review. So what's interesting really is, why do the important women behind Ulysses never appear in photos of this kind, and why were gender tensions so significant, and how is this relevant to the story of Ulysses? Okay, so to explore these questions, the exhibit moved through 6 sections. The first section, which was quite extensive, concentrated on looking at Joyce's family. Family members on whom he relied for emotional and material support, and who were represented very often within the pages of Ulysses. The second section was also quite broad and historicizing, looking at how women became more involved in the professional sphere in the early 20th century, and it introduces the role of patronage in early modernist publishing. Section 3, The Egoist, crosses the Atlantic to the United Kingdom and considered Harriet Shaw Weaver's substantial financial support of Joyce and her efforts to secure the publication of Ulysses in Britain. Section 4 was looking at The Little Review, focused on Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap and their serial publication of Ulysses in the New York-based magazine The Little Review, which, as I'm sure some of you will know, led to legal proceedings and an obscenity conviction against the editors of The Little Review. Section 5 will be familiar, I think, to anyone who certainly has been to the Sylvia Beach evening at the Rosenbach, the Shakespeare and Company, and it looked at Sylvia Beach's kind of pivotal role in bringing the full novel to print under the imprint of her Paris bookshop and lending library. And the last section summarized the relationships between the key professional women and James Joyce after the novel's publication. Okay. Right, so what I'm going to do is go through and look at some key objects which exemplify the approach and thinking behind the exhibit. But before I do that, I actually want to talk about my own individual and private copy of Ulysses, which I've acquired since I did the exhibit, and which wasn't actually part of the exhibit at all. It's not an especially pristine copy of Ulysses. This is the way it looks. This is a photo I took this afternoon on the kitchen table. There it is. It's Ulysses from 1928. And in a sense, it's testimony to Beach's long-term dedication to the publication of Ulysses. It went through more than 11 printings, and you can see this from the just inside the title page, the number of printings and the dates of them. So it gives you a sense of the kind of historicity of the text and of Beach's dedication to Joyce's cause. Okay, so in a sense, this to me is bibliographically interesting, especially the encoding of the history of the text, the story of the numbered copies, of the copies being seized, the Egoist press copies, which had been published by Harriet Shaw Weaver, being seized, and so on. this is all kind of interesting textually and contextually. But what interests me are the kind of marks left on this copy by one of its readers. So what we've got right at the front page is this lovely bit of writing. I'm not entirely sure how much of this you'll be able to read easily, but it's a dedication to a woman called Hilda from a man called Francesco de Tivoli. I have no idea who he was. You'll see right at the bottom of the page, mit meiner Liebe dein Francesco de Tivoli, right at the bottom. And at the top of the page, so there's his name, Francesco de Tivoli. It would be really fascinating if somebody could work out who he was. I've tried and not thus far a negative find. So I'm just interested in him as a reader. Obviously, in a sense, he has imbibe something of the kind of spirit of the Metropolitan book in its dedication by the Rome, Paris, Berlin, Bruxelles, and London, February 1932. And I'm only showing you one page of notes. There are actually 3. What fascinates me about Francesco as a reader is his what he's read and what he has written out. Ulysses can be put to so many uses by so many different kinds of reader. Here, in a way, what we've got is Ulysses being used as a sort of form of courtship to try and lure Hilda in some way. And again, I'd be kind of interested to know who Hilda is. Interestingly, the bits of the text that he's particularly drawn to are the bits that represent Joyce's mother and the kind of maternal theme in the kind of early chapters of the book. So you'll see that this is from Nestor, chapter 2. And, you know, the bit that he's underlined, I think, is quite interesting. But for her, the race of the world would have trampled him under her foot, a squashed, boneless snail. She had loved his weak, watery blood drained from her own. She was no more, the trembling skeleton of a twig burnt in the fire, an odor of rosewood and wetted ashes. She had saved him from being trampled underfoot and had gone, scarcely having been. So it's a sort of fascinating evidence of reading and engagement with the text, which I think speaks to its sort of immediate interest. I've just actually spent most of this term teaching Ulysses to a group of students. I didn't push it on them particularly strongly. It was an entirely optional engagement, but when it came to essay writing time, well over half the class opted to write on Ulysses, which sort of fascinates me that the book continues to renew itself amongst new generations of readers in spite of its, you know, length and apparent difficulty. So in a sense, this is a sort of fascinating edition from the point of view of the kind of materiality of the text, of the materiality of the object. And it brings me, in a sense, into the world of the exhibition and the family section, which I'm going to move on and discuss. So there was quite a, as I said, quite an extensive family section in the exhibit. And in particular, one of the things we did was get the correspondence of Joyce's mother from Cornell and put it on display. And I'm really fascinated by Joyce's mother and her surviving correspondence, which is incredibly fragile. And it was really fascinating to see the real objects from these letters, mainly from 1903. So let's talk a bit about the letters. I'm just going to get my papers in order here. So this is Joyce's mother, obviously in the middle of this photograph. I'll move straight to, here's one of her letters. This is from March the 2nd, 1903. And it's quite a long letter. I think it was 8 pages. And it gives a deep sense of the connection and trust that existed between Joyce and his mother, beginning with very practical advice about getting work published in newspapers, and includes the memorable line, "You cannot get on in your line without friends." Discussing worries about the other children, including Charlie and Poppy, and concluding with prayers for Joyce's spiritual and temporal devotion. And the final edition proposes that Joyce send over a suit that his mother will have cleaned and sent back to him. So at this time, you know, Joyce's mother was in Dublin. Joyce was in that kind of rather disastrous moment in his life when he'd kind of gone to Paris thinking that he might study medicine. And he hadn't been there very long. I think he lasted really from kind of December through till April, and did come home at Christmas. He was called back in April because his father knew that the mother was dying. So what's really fascinating about this letter is that it survived, really, that Joyce held on to it. And I think that the act of keeping things sort of often speaks to a desire to, you know, remember a certain kind of emotional affiliation. And if you think about how many times Joyce moved, that he managed to bring these letters all the way back from Paris, packed up and in a hurry back to Dublin, then through various moves around Dublin, hanging on to the letters, then moving back to Pola, then Trieste, still with these letters from his mother in hand. Joyce didn't very often keep personal correspondence, so it's sort of fascinating that this thing survives. And in a way, I think it speaks to a sort of deep connection between Joyce and his mother, that his mother actually, the emotional support was really quite significant. But also the pain of her loss inspired him, you know, to kind of get going and make something from his life. This is the one of the things we put on display. It's the census record from 1901, showing that by the time he was 19, Joyce was the eldest of 10 surviving children. And obviously the world of what we see here in the census is vividly evoked in chapter 5 of Portrait of the Artist as a young man. And noting the ages of the children, the census records the very regular patterns of birth. What it doesn't record, of course, is the stillbirths and miscarriages that occurred in apparently 1880, 1883, 1885, 1888, and 1897. One other child, Frederick, born 1895, died in infancy, and another, Mabel, born 1893, died when she was 17. So it's a really fascinating document, both in terms of what it reveals and what it doesn't reveal. And Joyce obviously described his mother as a victim of his father's ill treatment and his family life as a middle-class affair ruined by spendthrift habits. Moving on, another woman behind the scenes. This is a letter from Aunt Josephine, who is an aunt by marriage. It's one of several that I saw, and it records Josephine's response to the success of Portrait of the Artist. The tone is very informal, very warm. The punctuation is very spare. Did you read the Irish reviews of your book? There's a good one in the Irish Times. They compare you to Rousseau. I feel sure of the financial and literary success of your work. How delighted you must be, and how I would like to have a chat with you about it. She continues to praise firmly and presciently, telling Joyce that one of these days your signature will be something to be fought for. So Josephine is another one of these women behind the scenes who is, I think, playing a very significant role in facilitating Joyce's kind of emotional confidence. And of course, a big figure here behind the scenes is Nora. We could talk about Nora forever, their correspondence, their relationship, how she figures in the works. And so I'm going to leave that aside and move on to the kind of professional women in the story. One of the things we needed to do in the exhibit was to get to communicate some sense of the world of the work. And so we put on display this rather nice Remington portable typewriter. So typewriters were introduced to the mass market in the 1870s by the New York firm of Remington, and were a means by which women entered the workplace. This is a portable Remington, and it dates from the 1920s and was supplied with a carrying case. And this obviously created the possibility of working from home. And it's quite an extraordinary kind of bibliographical and textual fact, to me at least, that Joyce wrote Ulysses by hand, as we know from the Rosenbach manuscript, but asked and was totally dependent on various typists to help produce typescript of the work chapter by chapter. And the typists were very often women, not always, but mainly women, particularly in the latter years when Joyce was working really in a kind of coterie around Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Okay. So I'm just going to flip through a few bits and pieces of ephemera, just to give a sense of some of the things that were on display. This I really like. It's another thing that, might so easily have been lost. It's a telegraph that was sent from Joyce to Harriet Shaw Weaver on the day that Ulysses was published in Paris. And it just says, Ulysses published today. Thanks for all your generous kindness. And again, Weaver didn't just keep this tiny little scrap of paper, she kept the envelope in which it was received as well. And in a sense, again, that act of keeping something speaks to its value in a shaping value in the life of the recipient. This, I think, is one of the most interesting documents in the exhibit, though it doesn't actually necessarily look like much. It's a sheet which details monies which were regularly paid from Weaver to Joyce, and it gives kind of precise information about the extent of her financial generosity. So by the time this account was made up in July 1924, Weaver had given Joyce investments to the value of over £22,000, and the sum invested in various kinds of stock at fixed percentages gave Joyce a series of regular monthly payments. This money was free of tax, as the document notes. So in a way, Joyce's income for this year was £962, which was really quite a generous income at the time, but he was especially good at spending. And of course, Weaver's generosity was not the only source of income. He also had money, quite generous royalties from Beach. So interesting how both Weaver and Beach are so significant in Joyce's financial identity at this time in the early 1920s. Here's some more evidence of female material support. This is the American number of the Little Review from June 1918, and the very first iteration of Leopold Bloom in print. Ezra Pound was the foreign editor of the Little Review and secured Ulysses for its serial publication. The editors were Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. They were absolutely enthusiastic about Ulysses from the get-go, which they welcomed it as a prose masterpiece, which was even better than portrait. And I think what's interesting is that readers often think of Ulysses in relation to Paris in 1922 or Dublin in 1904, but the cultural geography of the work's original composition and transmission to print is very much more dispersed. The first readers of Ulysses were largely American and were those who encountered Ulysses serially in the Little Review in the period between March 1918 and December 1920. This is a photograph of the Jefferson Market Police Court in New York, where the editors of the Little Review were put on trial for the crime of publishing an installment of Nausicaa. And it's difficult to get a detailed sense of this as a lived experience. There's no transcript made of the trial proceedings, and there was no written decision handed down. But this photograph, in a way, communicates something of the world in which Anderson and Heap found themselves moving when the case came to trial before the magistrates. And the building is now a branch of the New York Public Library, and it was one of several local courts at the time, not especially familiar to the lawyer, John Quinn, who represented Anderson and Heap, who more ordinarily represented commercial clients in higher courts. And the building is a commanding example of high Victorian Gothic and included multiple holding cells, a women's prison and various courtrooms, and it must have been quite an intimidating place to be. Writing to Ezra Pound, John Quinn described police officers in blue uniforms with glaring stars and buttons, women and men by twos and threes awaiting arraignment or sentence, chauffeurs awaiting hearing, pimps, prostitutes, hangers-on, prostitutes. And Anderson and Heap were clearly fearless and brought many supporters and friends to witness proceedings. What they don't seem to have reckoned is that Quinn didn't believe that the case was winnable and was inadequately prepared. Nor did they realize that Quinn had become extremely hostile towards them, partly because of the risks taken by the Little Review, but more significantly because they were gay. So there's some very interesting unpublished correspondence between Quinn and Pound, and it refers to Anderson and Heap as two pissing rabbits doing the lesbian business. And all the qualities which one might seek in a lawyer, someone who's calm, unemotional, and in control of the facts, seem to have been lacking in Quinn, and his homophobia is really quite astonishing. I'm going to come back to Quinn and homophobia right at the end of the talk. A few more things to show. This is evidence of labour behind the scenes at Shakespeare and Company. This is a ledger kept by Sylvia Beach, a subscribers list for Ulysses, and it's obviously handwritten, and it's a potent reminder of the kind of necessary administrative labour and organisation going on behind the scenes at Shakespeare and Company. So Ulysses was sold out. I mean, it was issued on the 2nd of February 1922, and it had sold out by June the 15th, 1922. And in no small part, that success must be attributed to Beach's considerable administrative energy, efficiency, and business acumen. Beach agreed to publish Ulysses early in April 1921, after the decision against the Little Review was handed down in New York. She'd drawn up the prospectus for the publication of the book in that month, April 1921. She anticipated publication in October 1921 in a book of 600 pages. In the event, the book ran to 732 pages, and publication was delayed because Joyce rewrote and added so extensively on proof. The self-imposed deadline for publication on his 40th birthday was fortuitous, as otherwise Joyce might never have finished marking the proofs by marking and making the proofs by his own account illegible with interlineations. Beach took a considerable risk in deciding to commit to Ulysses and in allowing the considerable extra expense generated by extensive rewriting at the proofing stage. And the process didn't make her any great fortune because she gave Joyce a royalty of 66% of the net profits. The publication of Ulysses made her bookshop famous, as she predicted as soon as she knew she was going to publish it in April 1921. But it did so because she worked tirelessly on Joyce's behalf. So there's Beach in her bookshop in Paris, and gives her a kind of a strong sense of her and her fearlessness. What does all this add up to? Well, before I kind of draw things to a conclusion, I just want to say a little bit more about Harriet Shaw Weaver, another of the kind of publishing figures behind the scenes. Because Weaver, I think, is one of the women who hasn't necessarily been given enough credit for the work she did, not just as financial patron, but the arrangement was that Beach would publish a first edition of Ulysses in Paris, and thereafter it would be Weaver's responsibility to issue the work in the kind of English-speaking world. And so she was going to publish Ulysses under the Egoist imprint in London, and indeed she did so in October 1922. The copies were seized by the customs authorities in Britain, and very few of them actually survived. And so Weaver, in a sense, never really became particularly known or noted as the publisher of Ulysses. And Beach is the person who kind of continued to publish the work in that period between 1922 and 1932, when the Random House edition came out. So in a way, what we've got is evidence of extraordinary and enormous kind of material support behind the scenes, and women facilitating Joyce to a very extreme and unusual degree. And in a sense, what this points to is that works like Ulysses, which literary history very often privileges something like Ulysses as the kind of work of a kind of male solo authorial genius, and certainly that's true. Joyce wrote the book, but he couldn't have written the book, and it couldn't have come into being had he not had such significant administrative, psychological, emotional, and financial support. Having kind of made the exhibit and put the kind of items on display, it was very, in many ways, it was very kind of moving experience to put all of the material together, to take materials from Cornell and from Buffalo and from the Ransom Center and the New York Public Library and the British Library in London and so on, to put all of that material together to make this story about kind of feminine material support. It was a fascinating kind of process. But in the end, one of the things you have to think about is, what does it all add up to, and what new questions come out of the process of having combined this. And one of the things I've done since kind of finishing the exhibit is write a lot more about Weaver. So I've finished, and it will come out next year, an article called Finding Miss Weaver, which is all about the significance of her support for Joyce's, for Ulysses and for Joyce's career more generally. Another question which I think is complicated and interesting to try and answer is the significance of the fact that several of the women behind Ulysses were lesbian, the so-called sapphic midwives of modernism. And And one of the questions that arises here is, how is this significant, and is it significant textually and for interpretation? What motivated these women who came from different cultural contexts to be so supportive of Joyce? And how is the fact of their sexuality relevant? And how is it borne out in the text to some extent? To what extent does Joyce respond to this fact in the text? My view is that the fact of their sexuality is relevant and socially significant. That women who were not married were more likely to be working outside the home, and were more likely to have advanced progressive views. And with a sexuality was very often hidden and invisible to the kind of normal public gaze, they did actually admire Joyce's candor about sexual experience. What interests me is that the extent to which Joyce's actually signals any awareness of the of this as a fact, which is relevant to the publication of the work. What you've got is, you know, Anderson and Heap in New York, who are openly gay couple. You've got Adrian Monnier and Beach in Paris. So it just, and then a whole kind of network of other women in the kind of environment, particularly in Paris, in around the moment of the publication of Ulysses, are also gay. I think that Joyce's cultural politics and allegiances make themselves felt very overtly. But he does not support or openly acknowledge the fact of lesbian sexual experience. Not in any of the published or unpublished letters that I've read. Joyce was aware of John Quinn's intense homophobia, and the fact that he called Anderson and Heap the kind of two pissing lesbian rabbits, but he never corrected him. And that, I think, does leave a sort of question about Joyce's position in response to these facts. As I said, I haven't necessarily got a kind of settled view on this. One of the things I'd like to do is to go on and to think about this textually, particularly in relation to kind of cross-dressing and the Circe episode. And that's probably where my work is going to go in the next year. So thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing and open this to questions.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. That was absolutely fascinating.
There we go.
You have the share stop. There we go. No, not yet. There we go.
There. Fantastic.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
There was a comment, and you kind of finished this. The comment from KDM in the chat here, very interesting about Pound planning and deliberately and strategically to exclude women in the magazines. That's fascinating especially with Pound doing that and Quinn being so homophobic, that it's fascinating that was another hurdle then, wasn't it, for these women to then tackle to help Joyce?
Yeah, I mean, Pound is quite a complicated figure here. He's very, very determined to kind of get his gang of writers into the kind of public sphere. And he realizes very early on that, T.S. Eliot, Yeats, and Joyce and Ford Madox Ford are important writers, and he wants to get them all being published in a major periodical. Mm-hmm. But he's just so he's talking all the time to Quinn. He writes copious, lengthy letters to Quinn and meets Quinn a lot. And Quinn is prepared to really back Pound's editorial judgment. So in a sense, Pound has Quinn's checkbook and goes to thinks about running his own periodical, but I think he just realizes quite how much administrative labor, administrative and editorial labor it would be involved in actually establishing a journal of his own.
Mm-hmm.
So having kind of written up the plan in 1915, he then decides, actually, no, I'd be better off. And so by 1917, he's working with the Little Review. Interestingly, he goes to The Egoist with a plan and with Quinn's checkbook as well. And Dora Marsden, who's another lesbian editor behind the scenes here, says, no, we won't take Pound's money because it will reduce our editorial powers to zero. You know, so she won't take the money, but she doesn't need to, of course, because she's got Weaver's money. So there's a sort of interesting thing. So Anderson and Heap are absolutely stony broke, and I think the Little Review would have folded had it not been for the intervention of Pound. You know, it was getting thinner and thinner in the months of 1917, and then suddenly Pound arrives on the scene. And what's interesting is these people never meet each other. So Pound and Anderson don't meet in person, and Anderson and Quinn don't meet in person until actually quite a lot of work has already been done. So all the relationships are epistolary. And in a sense, Quinn is quite interested in Anderson, and when he meets her in person, he thinks, oh, you know, she's a very physically attractive woman, and wouldn't it be great to have an affair with her? And then he realizes she's gay, and he's horrified. So there's a sort of really interesting sets of tensions going on there. But yeah, absolutely. No woman shall be allowed to write for this magazine. It was definitely quite that bad.
Michael D asks, he says, you said something like it was the death of Joyce's mother that inspired him to make something of himself. He just wondered if you could expand a little more on that.
So it's a very counterintuitive argument, in a way, isn't it? Because, you know, she's gone in 1903, and Joyce has obviously not written much of Ulysses by 1903, but she's such a vivid textual presence in the book. You know, he makes so much of her memory for Daedalus. And although it's a sort of, you know, self-created in fiction, it just seems so incredibly textually vivid to me. Some of those letters have just got such extraordinary, I mean, she obviously, her eldest son, particularly when he's away in Paris for the first time, is the apple of her eye, and she believes in him so very strongly. She just has such you know, if you read the letters and you look at them, particularly with the eyes of a parent, you just think, well, what an extraordinary thing for a parent to write down, to say, yeah, you know, you're and Aunt Josephine as well. And Joyce says in a letter to Josephine, you know, that she in a way takes the place of his mother. Yeah. And she obviously sees it in those terms too. So there's a quite interesting psychology in terms of that relationship, which does ultimately sour, but not till after Ulysses.
She also, in that letter, there is a kind of matriarchal tone there where she talks about the financial and literary success. Like, oh, you're doing quite well now, you know, as an author. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
JM asks here, have you reviewed the contributions of women like Beach, not just to the original English, but the original French translation of Ulysses?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely covered a little bit about the French translation in the exhibit and put various bits and pieces of documents on it. But essentially, we concentrated on the 1922 story and what went before, the periodicals. Monnier, I think, is a really important and fascinating figure, and there's a lot, you know, but important within French literature as well as within within the kind of Joycean context. It's sad the way the relationship between Meunier and Beach ultimately sours as well, and that's quite a complicated story from what I can gather.
Someone asked, did Joyce ever acknowledge publicly the importance these women had to the publications of Ulysses?
I don't think so, really, not adequately. And it's interesting because one of the phrases that kind of occurs in the record is, you know, he inscribes the #1 copy of Ulysses to Weaver with the words "in token of gratitude," and Joyceans love that phrase, you know, "in token of gratitude," and that it's the #1 copy and so on. That's, I mean, so it's on display in Dublin. But actually that phrase "in token of gratitude" is used then on #2 copy, #3 copy, #4 copy. I mean, it's obviously kind of like, and they all get a copy. In, you know, Jane, Heap, Beach, everybody gets one. So it's a sort of much used phrase. So it's not, I mean, it's an inscription. It's not really a public acknowledgement. He says something interesting, I think, in one of those conversations. Is it Power? Is it Conversations with James Joyce? And he says something like about Beach, all she ever did was give me the best 10 years of my life, best 10 years of her life. Which that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. A couple comments here. Well, here's one from Jeanette. Who was wondering, you know, where can she find out more info on this? Are there? I mean, I know you're doing this work now, and will be contributing soon. But is there a place now where people can? Where would you direct people to go find out more about these?
So the blog posts have got quite a lot of information in them. The history in 10 objects. That's really quite detailed.
Yeah.
From there, I think Beach's Shakespeare and Company is worth reading, but I think it's an extraordinarily unreliable memoir. Weaver never published a memoir or account of her own life. Anderson does. I think Anderson's memoir or biography is called My 30 Years' War. That's quite an interesting read. But it is scrappy. You know, the sort of history that you're getting at, it is very much in kind of scraps and parts, you know, and that was one of the things that in a way some of the stuff that was on display was quite ephemeral and is not the kind of thing that you would normally expect to put on display. That it was kind of like you were trying to make a history out of kind of scraps and silences and bits and pieces rather than a kind of full record. But it worked. You know, if you could kind of make that point that, you know, what you've got is like, for example, that telegram, Ulysses published today, that's kind of an interesting thing, or the little notebook, you know, or, you know, things that don't necessarily look that special. For example, the, you know, the accounts, you know, it's a one-page of TypeScript that really tells you quite how much money Weaver gave to Joyce. That tells it. So it's one piece of paper telling a massive story.
Katie asks, in regarding Quinn's homophobia and Joyce's response or lack of response to it, she asks, do you think Quinn's checkbook was what made it impossible for Joyce to dissent or challenge in any way, that Joyce needed this support that Quinn was providing?
Not necessarily. I think Joyce was just very, very absorbed in his own intellectual and cultural world, and where he didn't necessarily need to intervene, that he was quite capable of receiving kind of long, ranting 16-page letters from Pound and responding in either not responding at all, or his response would be kind of 3 words. So I don't think to me, it's an interesting omission that he doesn't ever say anything, that there's nothing in any of the correspondence.
Another part of another question here from Joyce was from Joyce B about Joyce, asking, was he supportive of lesbians at the time? I think maybe the answer we already have, but But she also asks, I wonder how Nora felt.
Again, I don't know.
We don't know.
No answer on that. I mean, it would be interesting. There's bound to be something written on that, but I haven't come across it.
Why don't we, Ulysses is the Bloomsday's coming up, and there's a more of a general question here about Ulysses, and I'd like this one. Kirk asks, how do you enjoy Ulysses? Do you read cover to cover? Do you dip in and out from time to time? He says, am I wrong to dip in and out?
Oh my God, no. No, I can only dip in and out these days. So I was I'm a member of the Charles Peake Ulysses seminar in London, which has been going since 1986 and has the record. It's in the Oxford Book of Reading Groups for being the world's slowest reading group. It began in 1986 and we haven't actually finished reading Ulysses yet. Basically, we meet once a month, the first Friday of the month in Bedford Square in the centre of London, University of London. And we close read a paragraph. So last week we did a paragraph from Lestrygonians. The first paragraph from Lestrygonians, we just started a new chapter. So I imagine we'll be working on Lestrygonians. Probably, I don't know how many pages it is, but it'll be half a page a month. So it'll probably be a 4-year project. And by that stage, I'll know Lestrygonians very well. And then we'll move on to the next chapter. We've got several to go. So I don't think that, I mean, it's quite fascinating to find that the work bears that sort of extremely slow historicist, annotative, close reading, and that can be sustained. So that's sort of the method of reading it. I mean, when I'm teaching Ulysses, I tell my students to kind of dip in here and there and not to be overwhelmed by it. And I let them, read a few chapters here and there. I certainly don't kind of send them off to read the whole thing in a week. I let them kind of get a sense of it. It's interesting how many of them come back and say, do you know, I'm going to read the whole thing now. I didn't have time in the term, but I will read the whole thing. So that's sort of fascinating,
Yeah. That's for me always the mark of, works that will last are people reading them outside of school. So,
exactly. Yeah.
Well, do you have any Bloomsday plans?
Oh, I'm going off to a celebration of the life of Harriet Shaw Weaver in the South Coast. It's a very Weaver type of event.
Very nice.
So I'm going off to meet various people who are very enthusiastic about Weaver. It's not so much a Bloomsday festival as a Weaver festival, and somewhat aptly, it's on the South Coast of England, which is a very Weaver type of destination. So that's what I'm doing. Well,
that is wonderful. This work you're doing, and you're continuing to do. You're continuing to research this, correct? And will be in the near future.
I mean, I think probably you've got quite a few sort of bits and pieces of articles I want to write, and I am really quite fascinated by Weaver in particular. The way I feel as though I've done the Anderson Heap Beach story as much as I'm likely to, but I'm very interested in where the biography of Weaver can go.
And I hope we can find out who Francesco di Tivoli is.
So. If anybody can do that, that'd be great. Or Hilda.
We'll spread the word for that.
Did the quotes did the quotes do the job?
Well, thank you so much for joining us this year for this annual Bloomsday virtual in conversation. I really loved it, Claire. Everyone else, if you're looking for more literary, historical, or cultural engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website, check out the other programs and courses we have. And a reminder that our collections at the Rosenbach are open to all. You do not have to be an accredited university scholar. You don't have to be working on a book with a publishing deal, that kind of thing. Anyone can make an appointment at the Rosenbach to see the manuscript of Ulysses. You can visit our website, rosenbach.org, and find out how to make an appointment. And I invite you to please support the Rosenbach. You can do that by donation, or if you're not already a member, I invite you to join. And I hope you will join us on Bloomsday, June 16th for our day-long reading festival. If you can't come in person, we stream it live on our YouTube channel. Claire, have a happy Bloomsday.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely. Can I just put in one final pitch?
Yes.
I know questionnaires are extremely tedious, but it would help me enormously if people could respond to the questionnaire.
I have a survey that's going to go out to everybody that registered for this program. So if you watched it, you can answer. It's a very short survey. It's just 5 questions. And for those who didn't watch it yet, because we're going to post it on a YouTube channel, I'm going to send it to them as well. So hopefully we can get some responses, and that would be really great. We would appreciate that. All right, farewell, readers. Happy Bloomsday, and thanks for joining us. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.